was poisoned! He's lying!
When a starving child screamed, "Don't eat that food," in front of powerful men, polished shoes, and flashing cameras, everyone thought he was crazy. They laughed. They dismissed him. They dragged him away. But what they didn't know, what no one could have imagined in that moment, was that the warning of a homeless child would unravel a carefully protected lie and drag a wealthy man into a courtroom where money could no longer speak for him. Before this story ends, I want you to think about something. If you were standing there that day, surrounded by smiling executives and professional speeches, and a hungry child screamed in panic, would you have listened to the child or trusted the man in the suit? Tell me in the comments. And if you believe truth deserves a voice, especially when it comes from the least powerful, subscribe now. Because stories like this remind us that justice doesn't always begin with authority. Sometimes it begins with desperation. The boy's name was Eli. Most people never asked. To them, he was just another thin figure lingering near alleyways, shelter lines, and donation bins. Another quiet presence people stepped around instead of stepping toward. Another reminder of a reality they preferred not to see. Eli was 12 years old, but hunger had aged him in ways calendars never could. He had learned early that survival didn't come from hope. It came from attention. From watching closely, from noticing details other people ignored because they had the luxury to ignore them. He knew which grocery stores threw out food early, which dumpsters were locked, which bakeries dumped bread at night, and which sprayed it with chemicals so no one could take it. He knew that meat smelled different when it was dangerous. Not rotten, worse, sweet-sour, heavy, wrong. He knew because he'd been sick before, violently sick. The kind of sick where your body empties itself until there's nothing left to give. The kind that leaves you shaking on cold concrete, praying the pain passes before someone notices you there. Hunger had taught him rules, and breaking those rules could kill you. That morning, Eli woke up under a torn awning behind a closed laundromat. The air was sharp. His stomach cramped, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a dull, constant ache that never truly left him anymore. He sat up slowly, listening. Sirens in the distance, footsteps, the hum of the city pretending not to notice him. He stood, stretched stiff muscles, and began walking. He didn't know where he was going yet. Hunger would decide that later. Across the city, far from alleyways and damp concrete, Victor Hargreaves stood in front of a mirror and adjusted his cufflinks. They were imported, subtle, expensive enough to be noticed by the right people. Victor was 48 years old, successful by every measurable standard that mattered to him. Real estate, development, expansion. His name was attached to buildings people admired and neighborhoods people used to live in. He liked control. He liked predictability. And above all, he liked the way people listened when he spoke. Today was important, not because of charity, but because of optics. His company was hosting a public outreach event, free meals, friendly speeches, photos for press releases and social media, a demonstration of generosity that could be framed, shared, and remembered. Victor didn't think of charity as something you felt. He thought of it as something you showed. "Everything ready?" he asked his assistant while slipping on his jacket. "Yes, sir," media confirmed. "Food delivery arrived early." Victor nodded. "Good. Let's keep it efficient." Efficient. That word followed him everywhere. The courtyard was already busy when Eli arrived. Tables lined up neatly, banners stretched overhead. Volunteers moved with rehearsed purpose, cardboard boxes stacked behind the serving stations. Food. Eli hadn't planned to come here. He'd followed the smell. Hunger had pulled him like a rope tied around his ribs. A volunteer noticed him hovering and handed him gloves. "You can help clean tables," she said. "Just stay out of the way." Eli nodded. He always stayed out of the way. That's how you survived. He wiped tables, collected napkins, moved quietly. Then he smelled it. Not strong, Not obvious, just wrong. His body reacted before his mind did, a tightening in his stomach that wasn't hunger, a warning. He moved closer to the boxes. The labels were scratched off. That made his breath catch. Labels mattered. Labels told you dates, temperatures, warnings. Scratched labels meant someone didn't want questions. Eli leaned closer. The smell was faint but unmistakable. Food that had been warm too long. Food that had crossed a line you couldn't uncross. He stepped back, heart pounding. Victor stepped forward to speak. Applause rose. Cameras lifted. Servers removed lids from trays. Steam rose into the air. People smiled. And that's when Eli knew. Not suspected. Not guessed. Knew. This wasn't food you risked. Not ever. His voice came out before he could stop it. Raw, cracked, desperate. Don't eat that food. The sound sliced through the courtyard. Everything froze. Victor turned, irritation flashing across his face. Security moved instantly. Eli tried to speak again, but hands grabbed his arms. People laughed nervously. Someone shook their head. A crazy kid, someone muttered. Victor smiled for the cameras. And just like that, Eli was pulled away. His warning swallowed by noise, his truth dismissed by confidence. The first person fell sick that night, then another. Then another. By morning, one woman was in the hospital. Victor's phone buzzed non-stop. He frowned at the screen. "This is being exaggerated," he said sharply. "Handle it." PR teams went to work. Statements were drafted. Responsibility was deflected. The child was nowhere to be found. Eli spent that night curled behind a convenience store, stomach twisting, not from hunger, but fear. He had tried, he had warned them, and now people were hurt. Days passed. News outlets reported an unfortunate incident. The word negligence floated briefly before disappearing. Victor appeared calm on camera, but inside his company tension crept in. Emails were sent, questions asked quietly. Answers avoided, and somewhere beneath it all, a paper trail waited. Eli didn't know any of that. He only knew that people had gotten sick after they didn't listen, and that scared him more than hunger ever had. Because hunger was familiar. This wasn't. The first court notice arrived 2 weeks later. Victor read it twice, then a third time. Reckless endangerment, negligence. His jaw tightened. "This is absurd," he said, but when he looked up, for the first time in years, he didn't feel certain, because somewhere in his memory, unwanted, persistent, was the sound of a child's voice cracking with urgency, and the smell of food that should never have been served. Victor Hargreave told himself it was temporary. Bad press always was. A few statements, a few quiet calls, a carefully worded apology that admitted concern without admitting fault. He had navigated storms like this before. Regulatory complaints, zoning disputes, angry residents who didn't understand progress. This was smaller. Manageable. That's what he told himself as he stood in his office watching the city move beneath his window, convinced that height still meant safety. But the city didn't look the same anymore. Phones rang too often. Assistants avoided eye contact. Conversations stopped when he walked into rooms. Somewhere beneath the polished surface of his company, a tremor had begun. Soft at first, but impossible to ignore. 3 people had fallen ill. Then 5. Then the hospital confirmed it. Food poisoning. Severe. Preventable. Victor's legal counsel advised silence. "Let it cool," they said. "Public concern fades." But something didn't fade. The memory. That shout. The sound of it, thin, cracked, urgent, kept intruding at the edges of Victor's thoughts. He hated that most of all, that a child he had dismissed in seconds had somehow lodged himself where nothing else could. He pushed it away. Focus, control, forward. Across the city, Eli didn't have the luxury of pushing memories aside. He replayed the moment over and over, lying awake at night, staring at darkness that felt heavier than usual. The shout, the hands grabbing his arms, the way people had looked at him, not with curiosity or concern, but irritation, like he had interrupted something important, like he was noise. When he heard about the people getting sick, a cold fear settled in his chest. He hadn't imagined it. That didn't make him feel better. It made him feel responsible. Eli stopped going near the courtyard, stopped hovering around places with banners and speeches. He stayed closer to the shadows now, more cautious than before. Hunger was dangerous, but attention was worse. The first reporter found him by accident. She had been assigned to follow up on the story, not because it was explosive, but because it was easy. A human interest angle, a neat arc, a harmless curiosity. "Do you know the kid?" she asked a volunteer near a shelter. The volunteer shrugged. "He comes around sometimes, quiet, keeps to himself." That was enough. She spotted him later that afternoon, sitting on a low wall, tearing stale bread into careful pieces. "Eli?" she asked gently. He froze. She knelt slowly, keeping distance. "I just want to talk." He didn't answer. He had learned that talking rarely helped, but she noticed his hands. How careful they were. How deliberate. "You warned them, didn't you?" she said softly. His eyes flicked up. Just for a second. That was all she needed. The article ran the next day. It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't kind. It was curious. A homeless child's warning ignored before food poisoning incident. Victor read it during a board meeting. He didn't finish. "This is turning into a distraction," he snapped. "Why are we even discussing a child's speculation?" No one answered immediately. That silence unnerved him more than disagreement ever could. Behind closed doors, emails began resurfacing. Vendor invoices, cost comparisons, messages marked urgent, phrases that had once felt harmless now carried weight. Surplus inventory. Still usable. Remove labels before distribution. Each line sat quietly, waiting. The first lawsuit was filed that afternoon, then another. Victor's legal team grew serious. "This isn't just PR anymore," one of them said carefully. "We need to prepare." "For what?" Victor demanded. "For court." The word landed harder than he expected. Courtrooms were places he visited occasionally, never stayed long. Formalities, negotiations, settlements. This felt different, because this time, he couldn't see the end from the beginning. Eli was taken into temporary protective care after the article ran, not because anyone suddenly wanted to help, but because visibility had made him inconvenient. A social worker asked him questions in a quiet room with fluorescent lights. "Did you know the food was bad?" "Yes." "How?" "I could smell it." "Have you been wrong before?" He shook his head. They wrote things down. They looked at each other. No one smiled. The city health department opened an investigation. Inspectors reviewed records, storage conditions, transportation logs. One inspector paused longer than the others. "These dates don't align," she said. "Align with what?" someone asked. "With safety." The phrase echoed. Victor was advised not to attend the initial hearing. "Routine," they told him. "Procedural." He agreed. That night, alone in his apartment, Victor poured himself a drink and stared out at the lights again. The city looked the same as always. Busy, indifferent, vast. He had built his life believing that scale protected you, that numbers softened edges, that responsibility blurred as it spread. But something was sharpening, something was narrowing, and somewhere, a child who had nothing but his instincts was being asked questions by adults who suddenly realized those instincts might matter. The judge assigned to the case reviewed the file late into the evening. She had seen many versions of this story before. Power miscalculates, harm follows, apologies arrive late. What interested her wasn't the food, it was the warning. Warnings were rare, especially ones ignored. She closed the file slowly. "Bring the child in," she said. And with that decision, the direction of the story shifted, quietly, but irrevocably. Eli sat on the edge of a narrow bed that night, staring at unfamiliar walls. The room was clean. Too clean. Safe in a way that made him uneasy. He pressed his palms together, breathing slowly, trying to steady the feeling rising in his chest. He hadn't wanted to be heard. He'd only wanted them to stop. Outside, the city continued moving. Inside offices and courtrooms and shelters, lines were being drawn, and whether Victor Hargreave realized it or not, the distance between his penthouse and that child had never been smaller. The courtroom did not look the way Eli had imagined it. He had expected something darker, louder, something that felt more like punishment than procedure. Instead, it was clean, bright, almost polite. Wooden benches polished smooth by time and repetition, flags standing silently in corners. A seal mounted high on the wall, watching everything without expression. That frightened him more than chaos would have, because places like this didn't shout. They listened. Eli sat beside the court-appointed advocate, his feet not quite touching the floor. His hands rested in his lap, fingers interlocked so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. He kept his eyes down. The less attention he drew, the safer he felt. But safety was already gone. Across the room, Victor Hargreave entered with practiced confidence. His suit was darker than usual, conservative, deliberate, the kind of choice made by people who understood optics. He moved with calm efficiency, greeting his attorneys with quiet nods, his expression composed, controlled. If anyone watching didn't know the context, they might have assumed he belonged there. That assumption, that he belonged, had carried him far in life. Victor took his seat and glanced around the room, scanning faces, reporters, observers, a few members of the public who had nothing better to do than watch other people's problems unfold. Then his gaze landed on the child. For a brief moment, something flickered across his face. Not guilt, recognition. Eli didn't look like much from a distance. Too thin, too small, swallowed by borrowed clothes. He looked like someone who should not have been able to interrupt Victor's world so effectively. Victor looked away. The judge entered without ceremony. No dramatic pause, no unnecessary flourish. She sat, reviewed the file in front of her, and looked up. Her eyes moved slowly across the room, methodical, assessing, unimpressed by surface confidence. When they reached Victor, they lingered just a moment longer than necessary. That was the first time he felt it, not fear, pressure. "Let's proceed," the judge said. The prosecutor stood and outlined the case with deliberate restraint. There was no anger in her voice, no moralizing, just facts, dates, numbers, outcomes, a public event, food distribution, multiple illnesses, hospitalization. Victor listened, jaw tight, expression neutral. Then the prosecutor mentioned the warning. A minor, present at the event, verbally objected to the food being served. The room shifted. Eli felt it, even without looking up. The defense attorney rose quickly. "Objection," he said, "relevance." The judge raised a hand, not sharply but decisively. "Overruled," she said, "for now." Victor's attorney sat back down, displeased. The prosecutor continued. This warning was ignored. Ignored. The word echoed. Eli swallowed. He hadn't meant to be part of this. He hadn't wanted his voice to matter this much. He had only wanted them to stop. The judge leaned forward slightly. "I want to understand the timeline," she said, "and I want to understand the decisions made." Her gaze shifted to Victor. "Mr. Hargreave, you are present as a representative of your company?" "Yes," Victor replied smoothly, "and as someone who regrets what occurred." Regret was easy. The judge nodded once. "Proceed." Witnesses were called, medical professionals spoke clinically about symptoms, inspectors described findings without commentary, volunteers described confusion, panic, the suddenness of illness. Eli listened to words he barely understood, but the tone told him enough. People were upset, people were angry, and somehow all of that had traced its way back to him. During a recess, the advocate leaned toward him. "You don't have to speak today," she whispered. "Not unless the court asks." He nodded, relief washing through him, but relief didn't last. Because even as he sat there, silent, Eli could feel something forming around him. Expectation. The defense strategy became clear quickly. They didn't deny the illness. They minimized responsibility. They reframed the event as an unfortunate accident. A risk inherent in large-scale distribution. A logistical misstep, not negligence. And then, subtly, carefully, they began to talk about Eli. Not to him, about him. A distressed minor. Unverified claims? Speculation. Each phrase landed like a weight. Victor watched from his seat, outwardly calm, inwardly calculating. His attorneys were doing what they were paid to do: redirect, diffuse, dilute, and it was working, until it wasn't. The judge interrupted mid-argument. "Counsel," she said, "I want to hear about the vendor selection." The defense hesitated. "The vendor was licensed," the attorney said. "Approved." "And why was the original vendor replaced?" the judge asked. A pause. "Cost efficiency," the attorney replied. The judge's pen stopped moving. "Cost," she repeated. The word sat between them. Victor shifted slightly in his chair. The prosecutor seized the opening. "Your Honor," she said, "we intend to introduce internal correspondence related to that decision." The defense objected immediately. Relevance. The judge didn't look at them. Overruled. Documents were passed forward. Emails projected. Eli didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone in the room. This was not expected. Victor leaned forward now, his earlier ease gone. He scanned the screen, recognition dawning. He remembered those emails. They had seemed routine then. Now they felt exposed. "Surplus inventory," the prosecutor read aloud. "Removed labels. Expedite distribution." The judge looked directly at Victor. "Did you authorize this?" she asked. Victor's mouth opened, closed. "Yes," he said finally, "based on assurances of safety." The judge held his gaze. "Assurances from whom?" Victor hesitated. Names mattered. Silence stretched. From the corner of the room, Eli lifted his head slightly. For the first time since entering the courtroom, he looked up, not at Victor, at the judge. Their eyes met. The judge's expression did not soften, but it did focus. In that moment, something shifted. Not in the room, but inside Eli. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel invisible. The hearing adjourned with instructions. Further review, additional testimony, the child to remain available. Victor left quickly, surrounded by attorneys. Eli remained seated, unsure when it was appropriate to move. The judge stood to leave, then paused. She turned back. "Eli," she said, pronouncing his name carefully. He flinched. "Yes?" he whispered. "You did the right thing by speaking up," she said. "Whatever comes next, remember that." Then she left. Eli sat very still. Those words echoed louder than any shout he had made. Outside, Victor stopped beneath the courthouse steps and inhaled deeply. The air felt different here, thinner. He had underestimated this, not the case, the child. Because the child hadn't come with anger or accusation. He had come with truth. And truth, Victor was beginning to realize, did not negotiate. After the courtroom emptied, the silence stayed with Eli. It followed him down the hallway, into the waiting area, and back into the small room where the advocate offered him water he barely touched. Everything felt louder now, his breathing, the scrape of chairs, the distant echo of voices he couldn't quite hear. He had spoken only once, and yet everything had changed. That night, sleep refused to come. Every time Eli closed his eyes, he saw the courtroom again, the judge's face, the way the lawyers spoke around him as if he weren't there, the way Victor Hargreave had looked at him, not with hatred, not even anger, but with something colder, calculation. Eli had seen that look before. It was the same look store managers wore before deciding whether to call security. The look people wore when weighing inconvenience against compassion. Only this time, the stakes were heavier. Across the city, Victor sat alone in his office long after everyone else had left. The lights of downtown flickered beyond the glass, blurred by rain he hadn't noticed falling. His phone buzzed with messages he didn't open. He replayed the hearing again and again in his mind, dissecting every moment. The judge's tone, the prosecutor's timing, the way the room had shifted when the emails appeared. But it was the child that unsettled him most, not the shouting version, the quiet one. The way Eli had lifted his head just slightly and met the judge's eyes. Victor poured another drink and didn't taste it. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The next days brought pressure from places Victor hadn't anticipated. Shareholders asked questions, not loudly, but persistently. Partners requested reassurances that felt more like warnings. Advisors stopped saying if and started saying when. When the testimony happens, when the documents come out, when the public narrative turns. Victor had always believed that information could be managed, but information, he was learning, had a way of slipping free once enough people started pulling at it. Eli was pulled in a different direction entirely. Social services arranged meetings, evaluations, gentle conversations wrapped in official language. They asked him about his past, not in detail, but enough to remind him how fragmented it was. How long have you been on your own? Do you remember your parents? Have you ever felt unsafe? He answered what he could. Some questions didn't have answers. Others had answers he wasn't ready to share. What he didn't say was how tired he felt. Not physically, emotionally. He had spent his life learning how to disappear. Now people wanted him visible. The advocate explained the process slowly. "You may be asked to testify," she said. "Not yet, but soon." Eli nodded. The word testify sounded heavy, like something adults did. "What if I say the wrong thing?" he asked quietly. She met his gaze. "Just tell the truth," she said. "That's all anyone can ask." The truth. Eli thought of the smell again, the scratched labels, the certainty in his chest that day. He could tell the truth. What scared him was everything that came after. The defense team met behind closed doors. Victor listened as strategies were discussed. Credibility challenges, expert opinions, alternative explanations. They spoke in measured tones, confident that with enough doubt, clarity could be delayed. "Focus on the food chain," one attorney suggested. "Spread responsibility." "And the child?" Victor asked. A pause. "We need to be careful," another lawyer said. "Attacking him directly could backfire." Victor clenched his jaw. Careful. Everything had to be careful now. The health inspector's preliminary report arrived later that week. It wasn't dramatic. It was worse. Cold, precise, thorough, temperature violations during transport, incomplete documentation, food that should never have been approved for distribution. Victor read it twice. Then once more. This wasn't something he could explain away with charm. This was negligence, written plainly. The judge reviewed the same report that evening. She set it aside and leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled. She had seen enough to know where this was heading, but she also knew something else. Cases like this rarely hinged on documents alone. They hinged on courage, and the smallest witness often carried the heaviest weight. The day Eli was told he would testify, he felt his stomach drop, not from hunger, but from fear. They explained what would happen, where he would sit, who would speak first, how questions would be asked. "They might try to confuse you," the advocate said gently. "That doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong." Eli nodded, his hands trembling slightly. He practiced answering questions in his head. "What did you see? What did you smell? How did you know?" Simple things. Things he had lived with his whole life. And yet, the idea of saying them out loud, under bright lights, in front of strangers, felt overwhelming. Victor received notice of the child's scheduled testimony the same day. He stared at the paper longer than necessary. This was the moment he had hoped to avoid. Children were unpredictable. They didn't follow scripts. They didn't understand nuance or negotiation. They spoke plainly, and plain speech was dangerous. That night, Victor dreamed of the courtyard, but this time, no one laughed, no one smiled. Everyone turned and stared at him as the child shouted again, "Don't eat that food." Victor woke before dawn, heart racing. For the first time in years, he didn't go back to sleep. The courtroom filled quickly on the morning of the testimony. More reporters, more observers. Word had spread. A wealthy executive, a public charity event, a homeless child at the center of it all. Eli sat where he had before, feet dangling, heart pounding so hard he was sure someone could hear it. Victor arrived composed, but the cracks were there, subtle but real. The judge entered and took her seat. Her gaze moved immediately to Eli. "Are you ready?" she asked softly. Eli swallowed. "Yes," he said. The word felt small, but it was enough, because in that moment, the boy who had once survived by staying silent was about to speak in a room designed to remember every word, and once he did, there would be no going back. Eli's name was called, and the room seemed to shrink around him. He stood slowly, knees stiff, heart pounding so loudly it felt like it might break through his chest. Each step toward the witness stand felt heavier than the last, as if the floor itself were resisting him. He kept his eyes forward, fixed on a spot just beyond the judge's bench, afraid that if he looked anywhere else, at the reporters, the lawyers, the man in the suit, his courage might drain away. He raised his right hand, repeated the oath, and took his seat. The chair was too big. His feet didn't touch the floor. The prosecutor approached first, her voice measured, calm, intentionally gentle. "Eli," she said, "can you tell the court why you were at the charity event that day?" He swallowed. "I was hungry," he said simply. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. She nodded. "And what were you doing there?" "They asked me to help clean tables," he said. "So, I did." His voice trembled at first, then steadied as he spoke. He focused on the facts. Facts were safe. "Did you notice anything unusual before the food was served?" she asked. "Yes," Eli said. "The boxes." "What about them?" "The labels were scratched off." The prosecutor paused, letting the words settle. "And what did you smell?" Eli hesitated, searching for the right way to explain something he had always understood without words. "It smelled warm," he said. "Like food that's been out too long. Like when it makes you sick, even if it doesn't look bad." She nodded again. "How do you know that smell?" Eli looked down at his hands. "Because I've been sick before," he said quietly. "A lot." Silence filled the room. No one rushed to fill it. The prosecutor thanked him and stepped back. Then the defense attorney rose. His tone was polite. Too polite. "Eli," he said, "you've had a difficult life, haven't you?" Eli nodded. And you've eaten food from many places most people wouldn't consider safe. Yes. So isn't it possible, the attorney continued smoothly, that your senses are heightened? That you misinterpreted what you smelled? Eli felt heat rise in his chest. He looked up. I know bad food, he said. If I didn't, I wouldn't be here. The attorney smiled faintly. No further questions at this time, he said, sitting down. Victor watched from the defense table, his face unreadable, but his fingers tapped once against the wood, sharp, impatient. The judge leaned forward. Eli, she said, when you realized the food might be unsafe, what did you do? I tried to tell them, he said. They didn't listen, so I yelled. And why did you yell? Because people were already lining up, he said, and I didn't have time. The judge nodded slowly. You may step down, she said. As Eli returned to his seat, something strange happened. People looked at him, not with annoyance, not with pity, with attention. Victor felt it too, the shift in the air, the subtle but unmistakable change in momentum. This was no longer a case he could control with explanations and paperwork alone. The next witness was a logistics coordinator from Victor's company. He adjusted his tie nervously before speaking. We were under pressure to cut costs, he admitted. The original vendor was replaced last minute. Who approved that? The prosecutor asked. The man hesitated, then glanced at Victor. Mr. Hargreave, he said. Victor stiffened. The defense objected, but the judge waved it away. Continue, she said. The replacement vendor provided surplus inventory, the witness said. Food that couldn't be sold retail. And the labels? The prosecutor pressed. We were told to remove them, the man said. So, people wouldn't ask questions. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Victor leaned back, jaw clenched. The prosecutor introduced emails, projected large and unmistakable. Instructions. Cost comparisons. Phrases that sounded clinical but carried weight. Victor's earlier confidence eroded visibly now. His shoulders tightened, his gaze fixed on the table. When the health inspector testified, her voice was steady, unemotional. The food served that day violated safety standards, she said. It should have been destroyed. And if the child had not intervened? The prosecutor asked. More people would have been harmed, she replied, possibly severely. The judge closed her eyes briefly, then opened them. She looked at Victor. Mr. Hargreave, she said, do you wish to respond? Victor stood slowly. Yes, he said. I never intended for anyone to be hurt. The judge met his gaze. Intent does not erase responsibility, she said. Victor opened his mouth to argue, then stopped. For the first time, words failed him. Eli watched silently from his seat, heart still racing. He hadn't planned to be brave. He hadn't planned to change anything. He had only told the truth. And now, the truth was doing what it always did when finally allowed into the light. It was reshaping the room. The judge called a recess. As people stood and began to move, Victor remained seated, staring ahead. Eli sat too, unsure whether to move, unsure of what came next. But one thing was clear now, the balance had shifted, and nothing, not money, not influence, not silence, could push it back where it had been. The courtroom felt colder than before, not because the air conditioning had changed, but because something invisible had shifted. When the judge returned to the bench, his expression was no longer neutral. It was focused, alert, as if he had finally seen the full shape of the storm gathering inside this case. Daniel Wright sat straighter in his chair, crossing one leg over the other, fingers clasped confidently. He had recovered from the earlier discomfort. In his mind, this was still a battle he knew how to win. Emily, however, sat perfectly still. Her hands rested gently in her lap. Her shoulders were relaxed, but inside her chest, her heart was pounding like a drum before war, because she knew something Daniel didn't. Truth doesn't rush. Truth waits. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Daniel. "Mr. Wright," he said slowly, "you've painted a picture of generosity, responsibility, and fairness." Daniel nodded politely. Of course he had. "But this court does not rely on pictures," the judge continued. "We rely on patterns." A flicker passed across Daniel's face. "Patterns," the judge repeated, "over time." The courtroom was silent. The judge turned a page in the file. "For years," he said, "you controlled the finances of the household. You handled the accounts. You decided what was spent and what was not." Daniel shrugged slightly. "I was the primary earner, Your Honor." Emily's fingers tightened. "And during that time," the judge went on, "your wife had no independent access to funds, no personal savings, no visibility into shared accounts." Daniel smiled faintly. "That was by mutual agreement." The judge's eyes lifted. "Was it?" The word hung in the air like smoke. Emily swallowed. The judge leaned back. "Mrs. Wright," he said gently, "I'd like you to tell the court something." She looked up. "Tell us," he said, "what happened the day you asked for money to visit your mother?" Daniel's head snapped toward her. Emily hesitated. That day had lived in her bones for years. She took a breath. "It was winter," she began. "My mother had been ill for weeks. I asked Daniel if I could take the train to see her. I told him it wouldn't cost much." Her voice was steady, too steady. "He laughed," she continued. "He said I was being dramatic. He said I wanted to travel. I should earn my own money." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Daniel shook his head sharply. "That's not how it happened." Emily didn't look at him. "I remember standing in the kitchen," she said. "I remember the kettle boiling over. I remember thinking I was asking my husband for permission to care." Her voice cracked. "And he said no." Silence. The judge nodded slowly. "Did you go anyway?" Emily shook her head. "I couldn't," she whispered. "I had no money." Daniel exhaled loudly. "This is emotional exaggeration," he said. "She's turning a disagreement into a tragedy." The judge raised a hand. "No," he said. "She's describing control." Daniel stiffened. The judge turned another page. "Over the course of this marriage," he said, "there are multiple instances where funds were denied, delayed, or conditioned." He looked up. "That is not partnership." Emily closed her eyes. The judge wasn't done. "Mr. Wright," he said, "do you believe marriage requires obedience?" Daniel blinked. "Of course not," he said quickly. "Then why?" the judge asked. "Did every financial decision require your approval?" Daniel opened his mouth, closed it. Emily felt something unfamiliar rise in her chest, not hope, relief, because for the first time, someone else was asking the questions she had swallowed for years. The judge shifted his gaze. "Mrs. Wright," he said, "why did you stay?" The question pierced her. She could have given 100 answers. Fear, habit, love, shame. But she chose truth. "Because I believed him," she said softly. "When he said I was nothing without him, when he said no one else would want me, when he said this was normal." Her voice broke. "I thought this was what marriage was." Daniel laughed bitterly. "This is absurd," he said. "She's rewriting history." The judge looked at him. "No," he said quietly. "She's remembering it." The courtroom felt heavy now. Emily wiped a tear from her cheek. The judge leaned forward. "One more question," he said to her. "What changed?" Emily thought of the night she packed her bag, the night she stood in the mirror and didn't recognize the woman staring back. "I realized," she said, "that staying was teaching me to disappear." Her words echoed. Daniel stared at her. For the first time, there was no arrogance in his eyes, Only confusion. The judge closed the file. "This court," he said, "does not punish success. It does not condemn wealth." He paused, "But it does not excuse dominance disguised as provision." Daniel's jaw clenched. "We will adjourn briefly," the judge said. "When we return, we will address custody, assets, and accountability." The gavel struck. Emily exhaled. Her legs trembled as she stood. People whispered as she walked past. Some looked at her with sympathy, some with respect. Daniel remained seated. He stared straight ahead. For the first time in his life, his money had not spoken for him. Outside the courtroom, Emily leaned against the wall. Her breath came in shallow waves. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't winning. She was surviving. And for the first time, that felt like enough. If you're still here, ask yourself something. How many people around you are quietly disappearing, just to keep the peace? And how many truths stay buried because power is loud? If this story is touching something real inside you, don't stay silent. Comment, share your thoughts, and subscribe, because what comes next will change everything. The courtroom emptied, leaving a silence that was almost palpable, as though the very walls were holding their breath. Daniel Wright sat alone at the defense table, hands clasped tightly, jaw clenched, eyes darting at papers he barely saw. The weight of the judge's words lingered, pressing on him like an invisible hand. For the first time, authority had not bowed to his status. For the first time, influence could not shield him from scrutiny. Emily remained seated, her hands folded in her lap, face pale but steady. She had never felt such a strange mix of relief and fear. Relief because finally her voice had been heard. Fear because she knew the next steps, the unraveling of control, the exposure of truth, would not be easy. There were still battles to fight, still questions to answer, still decisions to face. The judge returned after a short recess, her presence commanding the room instantly. She motioned for the next phase of proceedings to begin. The focus shifted to the financial documents, the ledgers, bank statements, and digital records that mapped years of control, denial, and manipulation. Every entry, every transfer, every note revealed a pattern. Calculated oversight, subtle restrictions, and the slow suffocation of autonomy. Daniel's attorneys attempted to intervene, pointing out minor discrepancies, arguing context, emphasizing technicalities. But the judge was unmoved. She had seen enough of real patterns to know that small technicalities could not mask repeated behavior. Emily's advocate rose, laying out the narrative calmly, yet with undeniable clarity. She traced the trajectory of control from small, seemingly inconsequential denials to the systemic restriction of access and freedom. Each example reinforced the reality Emily had endured: a life constrained, decisions dictated, autonomy undermined. Daniel shifted uneasily. He interjected occasionally, voice low but forceful, claiming misunderstandings, misinterpretations, exaggerations. But each attempt was countered by precise evidence, receipts, email threads, and testimonies that corroborated Emily's account. The courtroom seemed to lean toward truth, not wealth. The judge paused mid-sentence. "Mr. Wright," she said, her tone calm but firm, "do you believe it is acceptable to enforce control over another adult under the guise of protection or provision?" Daniel opened his mouth, then closed it. He felt the weight of those words pressing down in a way he had not experienced before. No polished smile, no confident deflection, no legal loophole could answer that question. He remained silent. Emily's voice broke that silence. "No," she said softly but clearly, "it is not acceptable." The simplicity of her statement carried power. The courtroom seemed to still, as though absorbing the magnitude of truth so plainly spoken. Daniel's defenses felt flimsy, insignificant against the reality of her lived experience. The judge turned her gaze to the financial documents. "These ledgers," she said, Demonstrate a consistent pattern of control over funds, limiting access and decision-making capacity. How do you justify this as fair partnership? Daniel's fingers drummed nervously on the table. He wanted to speak, to rationalize, to convince, but words failed him, because fairness had never been the priority. Control had, maintenance of image had, preservation of authority had. Now that authority was unraveling before his eyes. The judge's tone softened slightly, but the weight remained. This court recognizes the complexity of relationships and the nuances of personal responsibility. However, when actions systematically undermine autonomy and restrict basic freedoms, consequences are necessary, not punitive, but corrective. Emily felt a flicker of hope. She had never allowed herself to imagine this moment, being acknowledged not as a complainant, not as a victim, but as a person whose experiences carried weight, whose autonomy mattered. Daniel's face betrayed tension. He had counted on his power, on perception, on the quiet assumption that his status would overshadow evidence. He had underestimated the impact of truth, the clarity of lived experience, the inevitability of consequences when control is exposed. The next witnesses were financial consultants who analyzed the patterns in the ledgers. They spoke slowly, carefully, highlighting how repeated restrictions on access and approval requirements created a dependency that was not coincidental, but structured. Every word reinforced Emily's narrative. This was not about misunderstanding or oversight. This was about design, about control. Daniel tried to interject again, his voice edged with frustration. "These are just technicalities," he insisted. "Minor errors, context missing." The judge's gaze fixed him. "Minor or not, patterns are clear. Consistency matters in these cases. Repetition reveals intent. The court cannot ignore repeated structures of limitation and control simply because they are presented in technical terms." The room held its breath. Observers leaned forward, the tension so thick it seemed to thrum in the air. Emily's hands, previously trembling slightly, now rested firmly in her lap. She felt a strange clarity. Every detail, every email, every denied request had led to this moment. Every moment of fear, every decision she had swallowed had built a case stronger than any lawyer could fabricate. Outside the courtroom, the media began reporting, whispers growing into stories. A woman challenging control, a man of wealth exposed to scrutiny, a child whose previous warnings had been ignored. The narrative was shifting. Public attention, subtle at first, now began to focus on accountability. Inside, the courtroom advanced toward testimonies that would make Daniel confront consequences he had long believed were avoidable. Each witness reinforced the narrative. Each piece of evidence chipped away at the facade. Emily remained steadfast. Her voice, her presence, her truth, all were becoming undeniable. The judge paused to allow the weight of proceedings to settle. "This court seeks resolution that restores autonomy, ensures fairness, and prevents future harm," she said. "Mr. Wright, your opportunity to contribute constructively remains, but the court will not allow intimidation, minimization, or deflection to obscure the reality before us." Daniel exhaled sharply. He felt the walls closing, his comfort dissolving. Status, wealth, influence, none of it mattered in the face of documented patterns and testimony grounded in reality. Emily exhaled too, but differently. Relief, cautious, and measured, swept over her. She had survived so many silences, so many denials, so many nights of fear and uncertainty. Now, she was being heard. Now, truth carried weight. The next day, procedural motions advanced. Custody arrangements, asset division, financial oversight, all were discussed with meticulous detail. Daniel attempted resistance, arguing technicalities, questioning interpretations. But the court, guided by the clarity of evidence and the consistency of testimony, moved steadily toward accountability. Eli's role, though indirect in these proceedings, echoed throughout. The child's early intervention had set in motion a chain reaction: awareness, investigation, accountability. Without his warnings, without his courage to speak despite fear, the structures of control might never have been exposed. By the close of the day, Daniel Wright sat silently, stripped of posturing. The judge reviewed procedural next steps, outlining measures to protect autonomy, ensure fairness, and uphold responsibility. Emily listened, absorbing the details, knowing each point signaled progress, not just legally, but morally. And somewhere in that courtroom heavy with tension, a quiet truth emerged. Control could not withstand exposure. Silence could no longer shield. Wealth could no longer obscure accountability. The day ended, leaving the courtroom charged with anticipation, the air thick with possibility. Emily had reclaimed fragments of her life. Daniel had faced an unassailable reflection of consequences, and the truth, long suppressed, now had the weight to demand action. If you're still following, pause for a moment and consider, how often does silence protect the powerful while the vulnerable carry the burden of speaking? Comment your thoughts below and subscribe, because what comes next will be the turning point, the decisive moment where consequences become unavoidable and justice moves toward its conclusion. The courtroom was hushed, every eye fixed on the judge, every breath held in quiet anticipation. Daniel Wright sat rigidly, suit impeccable, hands clasped tight, jaw tense. The veneer of control he had relied on for decades was cracking. For the first time, he was acutely aware that neither influence nor wealth could shield him from the consequences of his actions. Emily sat upright, shoulders squared, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with a strange clarity that came from finally being heard. Every injustice, every denied request, every moment of silent suffering had led to this point, and now truth had power. The judge leaned forward, reviewing the final documents one last time. The room seemed to hold its collective breath. Cameras clicked softly in the background. Reporters scribbled notes. Even Daniel's attorneys were tense, their earlier confidence replaced by careful calculation. "Mr. Wright," the judge began, voice steady, measured, authoritative. "This court has carefully reviewed the evidence, testimonies, and documented patterns over the course of this case." Daniel shifted slightly, his mouth opened then closed. He knew he could not persuade the court with charm or rhetoric this time. Facts, patterns, and truth were all that mattered. The evidence demonstrates repeated control, restriction of autonomy, and manipulation under the guise of protection and provision. The judge continued, "This is not a matter of misunderstanding or isolated incidents. The patterns are consistent, intentional, and significant." Daniel's shoulders tightened. He exhaled slowly, fighting an instinct to defend, to argue, to reclaim what he had lost. The judge turned her gaze toward Emily. "Mrs. Wright, your testimony has been forthright, detailed, and corroborated. You have demonstrated resilience and clarity. Your voice has revealed patterns that might otherwise have remained obscured." Emily nodded slightly, blinking back a tear. Relief coursed through her. She had feared exposure, confrontation, and judgment for so long. Now, her truth was validated. "And now," the judge said, her tone firm, "the court will determine the corrective measures necessary to restore autonomy, protect well-being, and ensure accountability." Daniel's legal team muttered under their breath, searching for loopholes, for any escape. But the court was resolute. The documents, testimonies, and evidence were unassailable. The financial control previously exercised by Mr. Wright over joint and personal accounts will be lifted. The judge declared, Mrs. Wright shall receive independent access to funds, and all future financial decisions must be made jointly or through transparent, documented processes approved by the court. Daniel's lips pressed into a thin line. He had underestimated the weight of documentation, pattern, and lived experience combined. Custody and care arrangements will reflect the best interests of all parties involved, the judge continued, her eyes locking briefly on both Emily and Daniel. Decisions will prioritize safety, autonomy, and fairness. Attempts to undermine these provisions will be met with immediate legal action. Daniel's head drooped slightly. There was no immediate outburst, no dramatics, just the slow realization that his authority had been measured, evaluated, and curtailed. Emily's advocate whispered softly, "It's done. You're free." Eli's presence was quiet but undeniable. Though he had not returned for the final verdict, the ripples of his early warning had set this chain in motion. Without his courage to speak, the underlying patterns might never have been exposed. The courtroom, the judge, and the proceedings all owed a debt to a child who had only sought to prevent harm. The judge tapped the gavel lightly. This court adjourns, with corrective measures to take effect immediately. Let it be known that accountability is not optional, and that truth carries weight, regardless of status or wealth. The room exhaled collectively. Emily felt her shoulders relax, a tension she hadn't realized she had been holding for decades finally melting away. For the first time in years, she felt seen, validated, and empowered. Daniel remained seated a moment longer, staring at the floor. His mind raced. Calculations, regret, disbelief. How had control slipped through his fingers so completely? The wealth, the influence, the carefully curated image. It all mattered less than he had imagined. Patterns, truth, consequences. Those were the currencies that now governed his life. Outside the courtroom, the media captured every step. Cameras followed Emily as she walked with dignity, not triumph, but quiet strength. She had reclaimed a part of herself long denied. She had survived. She had spoken. She had been heard. Eli, somewhere in the city, watched the news quietly, a small sense of satisfaction rising in his chest. He hadn't sought recognition, just safety. Yet his voice, the warning that had once been dismissed, had reshaped events far beyond his understanding. The moral was clear. Power alone does not protect. Wealth alone does not shield. Silence, when coupled with control, can harm. And courage, even from the least powerful, can change everything. For Emily, it was a new beginning. For Daniel, a hard reckoning. And for Eli, the quiet confirmation that speaking truth, even when ignored, can ripple into consequences far greater than one could imagine. As the city carried on outside, life resumed its rhythm, but some things had shifted irreversibly. Justice had found its measure, and truth had triumphed, not with spectacle, but with persistence, clarity, and courage. And in the quiet aftermath, one lesson remained. The smallest voices, the quiet warnings, the overlooked truths, they are the ones that often carry the heaviest weight. Because in the end, accountability cannot be silenced, and justice always finds a way to reveal itself. After the courtroom emptied, Emily walked slowly through the echoing hallways, her footsteps soft against the polished floors. The weight that had pressed down on her chest for so many years seemed lighter now, though not gone entirely. Freedom was new, unfamiliar, almost fragile. She had reclaimed her autonomy, but the memories lingered. Long nights of quiet fear, denied requests, whispered warnings ignored. Outside, the city continued in indifferent rhythm. Cars honked, pedestrians hurried. Life moved as though nothing had changed. But for Emily, everything had changed. She carried herself differently now, her gaze steadier, her shoulders firmer, her mind no longer confined by fear of a man's dominance. Daniel Wright left the courthouse in silence, flanked by his lawyers. The confidence that had always defined him was fractured. He had survived scandals, negotiations, and crises, but never like this. His wealth could not undo the patterns revealed. His influence could not erase the testimonies laid bare, and his carefully constructed image could not withstand the judgment that truth had delivered. Every step he took was measured, each breath heavy with awareness that the world he had controlled with authority and manipulation had slipped from his grasp. Eli sat quietly on a worn bench near the courthouse steps. He had watched from a distance, unseen by most, feeling the quiet weight of what he had started. His warning, shouted on a day that had seemed insignificant, had rippled far beyond his understanding. Lives had been affected. Control had been exposed, justice had been pursued, and he had been the spark. For a moment, he allowed himself a small, rare smile, a recognition that even the smallest voice can have enormous impact. In the days that followed, Emily began the slow process of rebuilding. She set up her own accounts, re-established independence, and reconnected with the parts of her life that had been overshadowed by years of control. Each small decision, buying groceries, paying bills, planning a visit to her mother, felt revolutionary. The freedom to make choices for herself, once ordinary and taken for granted, now felt precious and deeply earned. Daniel struggled privately. The walls of his penthouse, once comforting, now felt confining. Meetings that had been routine were now exercises in scrutiny and tension. Every decision carried the shadow of accountability. Colleagues looked at him differently. Associates whispered. Even the most loyal advisors no longer assumed. His judgment was unquestionable. Power, he realized, was ephemeral when truth revealed its fragility. Eli continued his quiet life, observing from the edges of society, aware that his role in these events was both pivotal and invisible. He returned to routines he had long maintained, wandering the city streets, helping where he could, watching, learning. He had seen firsthand how courage and honesty, even from the most vulnerable, could redirect forces far larger than oneself. And he carried that lesson silently, knowing that in life, the smallest interventions often yield the largest consequences. The media continued to follow the story, but their focus shifted naturally. Sensationalism gave way to reflection. Coverage turned from shock to analysis. Articles explored the dynamics of control, the courage of victims, and the role of witnesses who dared to speak. Emily's voice, calm but firm, began to appear in interviews. She spoke of truth, accountability, and the importance of listening to those whose voices are often dismissed. Daniel attempted to reclaim control over his public image, but the patterns exposed in court were difficult to erase. Apologies felt inadequate, press statements hollow. The public perception had shifted irreversibly. What had once been deferred, ignored, or silenced now carried weight that would influence not only his career, but his personal life, for years to come. Emily began mentoring others in subtle ways, sharing lessons learned from her experience. She became a quiet advocate, helping those trapped in control dynamics to recognize patterns, reclaim autonomy, and seek support. She did not do this for recognition. She did it because she understood the cost of silence, the power of voice, and the necessity of courage. The judge's final words echoed in her mind. Accountability is not optional, and truth carries weight. She had not needed to shout, to lecture, or to dramatize. Her authority and clarity had ensured that consequences were inevitable, not through spectacle, but through persistence and evidence. Emily had learned that justice, once engaged, is patient, but relentless. Daniel's private reckoning grew heavier as he reviewed his actions and their consequences. Money, influence, and control had insulated him for decades, but they could not insulate him forever. He faced legal obligations he had never considered seriously before, reputational damage that could not be reversed, and the personal realization that dominance over others carries a cost that eventually finds its due. Eli, small and quiet, remained a silent witness to the aftermath. He watched the city move, noting small injustices and small acts of courage, recognizing that life continued in complex cycles of power, vulnerability, and morality. He understood that speaking out even once had changed trajectories, that even small voices matter, that truth, though fragile in one moment, gains momentum in ways unseen. Weeks later, Emily visited her mother. She carried herself with quiet confidence, her decisions made independently, her autonomy restored. Each choice was deliberate, uncoerced, and reaffirming. She smiled freely, laughed without hesitation, and felt a freedom she had almost forgotten. The lessons of the courtroom, of exposure, of persistence and courage were hers to carry forward. Daniel, meanwhile, retreated into reflection. He could no longer operate solely on authority. Influence required accountability. Decisions, once unilateral, now demanded consideration and transparency. He had glimpsed the fragility of control, the limits of wealth, and the enduring power of truth. Eli continued his quiet life, witnessing the city's rhythms, observing moments of injustice and courage alike, carrying within him the memory of the moment he had spoken out, a warning, a shout, a small act with consequences far beyond his comprehension. And in this convergence of voices, decisions, and consequences, a simple but profound truth emerged. Accountability cannot be evaded, silence carries weight, and even the smallest voice can alter the trajectory of many lives. The city moved on, unaware of the subtle shifts beneath its surface, but those directly involved, Emily, Daniel, Eli, the judge, understood something essential. Power is temporary, influence is fragile, truth endures, courage transforms. And in the quiet aftermath, life carried lessons for all who were willing to listen, to act, and to speak, even when the world seemed to ignore them. The courthouse was quieter than ever, the air heavy with anticipation. Word had spread that this day would mark the culmination of months of testimony, evidence, and confrontation. Every face in the room carried weight. The attorneys, the staff, the observers, all aware that the final decisions would leave ripples that could not be undone. Daniel Wright sat at the defense table, shoulders stiff, hands clasped tight. The confidence that had defined him for decades was gone, replaced by a cold awareness that power, influence, and wealth could not shield him from accountability. He had faced legal scrutiny before, but never with this level of clarity and inevitability. Every document, every testimony, every subtle action had been meticulously recorded, leaving no room for deflection or delay. Emily entered with quiet dignity. She carried herself differently now, calm, steady, yet resolute. Every step was deliberate, every breath measured. She had survived years of manipulation, endured control disguised as protection, and now she stood finally free. In the light of truth, the courtroom felt smaller now, intimate, focused, because her courage had shifted the atmosphere. She was no longer just a participant, she was the axis around which justice would turn. Eli, though small and often unnoticed, occupied a space in the periphery. His earlier warnings, once dismissed, had become the catalyst for change. He had spoken out when it mattered, and the chain of accountability had begun with him. He watched silently, understanding the enormity of what his small voice had triggered. The judge entered and took her seat. Her presence was commanding, calm, and unyielding. She reviewed the final reports, evidence, and statements, then looked directly at Daniel Wright. "Mr. Wright," she said, voice steady but piercing, "this court has reviewed all evidence thoroughly. The patterns of control, financial restriction, and systematic undermining of autonomy have been documented and corroborated. Intentions do not negate consequences, and wealth does not exempt one from accountability." Daniel swallowed, the words sinking into him like stones. He had counted on deflection, charm, and technicalities. None of them worked here. None of them could. The judge's gaze shifted to Emily. "Mrs. Wright, your testimony has been consistent, detailed, and courageous. You have reclaimed a voice that was long silenced. The court recognizes your right to autonomy, safety, and respect, and has structured corrective measures accordingly." Emily felt a tremor in her chest, but it was not fear. It was relief. It was quiet validation. Years of silent endurance, of swallowed words, of unseen struggles were acknowledged. She could breathe. She could decide. She could live without the heavy weight of imposed control. The judge turned back to Daniel. "Effective immediately, you will have defined access only within legal parameters, under oversight designed to protect autonomy and ensure accountability. Financial authority over joint and personal matters will no longer be unilateral. Any attempts to circumvent this order will result in immediate legal action. This court will not tolerate further manipulation or control." Daniel remained silent. He had no words that could erase the patterns now exposed. The documents, testimonies, and the unwavering courage of those he sought to control had dismantled his authority. For the first time he understood that power is temporary, influence fragile, and truth enduring. Eli's presence, though quiet, was monumental. The small voice that had once shouted a warning about contaminated food had set in motion this cascade of accountability. Though unseen by most, he had altered trajectories far beyond his understanding. Courage, he realized, need not be loud to be effective. It only needed to be steadfast. The judge continued, addressing the courtroom. "This case demonstrates the importance of speaking out, of paying attention to warnings, and of holding those in positions of authority accountable. Justice is not measured by wealth or status, but by courage, truth, and responsibility." Emily exhaled slowly, a weight she had carried for years finally lifting. The legal battle was over, but the emotional and psychological reclamation of her life had only begun. She knew the path ahead would still require strength, but she had proof, both internal and external, that she was no longer bound by manipulation or fear. Outside the courthouse, cameras captured the subtle yet powerful shift. Observers noted her dignity, the calm authority in her demeanor, and the quiet gravity of her triumph. The public began to understand. Control is not guaranteed, influence is not absolute, and courage, even from the smallest voices, can set in motion irreversible change. Daniel left last, flanked by attorneys. The mansion, the business dealings, the social standing, all remained intact materially, but morally and socially, he was diminished. He had been forced to confront the reality that dominance over others comes with a cost. Patterns of manipulation, once invisible, had been exposed. Truth had prevailed. Eli walked away from the courthouse quietly, blending into the city streets as he always did. He had seen firsthand the power of speaking out, of observing carefully, of acting decisively when necessary. A single voice, small and vulnerable, had changed the lives of many. The lesson was simple, yet profound. Courage and truth can ripple far beyond the immediate moment, reaching outcomes unimaginable. Emily's first steps toward independence were deliberate. She opened her own accounts, re-established control over her finances, and reconnected with her personal network. Every action, no matter how small, was a reclamation of freedom. Each decision was an assertion of autonomy long denied. The courtroom, now empty, seemed to hum with the echoes of justice served. The ripple effect of accountability had begun. Clear boundaries, structured oversight, and validation of truth. Patterns of control were dismantled, and the weight of silence was no longer absolute. In the quiet aftermath, one truth remained undeniable. No matter how small the voice, no matter how powerless one may feel, courage, truth, and persistence can reshape destinies. Accountability is relentless. Silence cannot shield wrongdoing forever, and even the least powerful among us can spark consequences that resonate far beyond expectation. The city moved on, unaware of the monumental shifts beneath its surface, but the lives of those involved, Emily, Daniel, Eli, the judge, had been irrevocably transformed. Freedom, justice, and truth had prevailed, not through spectacle, but through courage, consistency, and moral clarity. And in the echoes of this final chapter, one lesson endured. Power is fragile, influence fleeting, and control cannot withstand the persistent light of truth. Speak, act, and observe. Courage changes everything. Silence can be fatal. Emily walked into the sunlight, free at last. Daniel faced the consequences he had long evaded. Eli carried the quiet triumph of his intervention, and the world, whether it noticed or not, had shifted toward justice. Not by chance, but by the deliberate persistence of truth. Justice had been served. Lives had been altered, and the smallest voices had proven the loudest in their impact.